Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of 401 Access Denied. It's your podcast every 2 weeks. My name is Joseph Carson, and I'm the Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Lycotic, based in Tallinn, Estonia. And I'm really pleasure to be here. We've got an exciting discussion today, all about critical infrastructure. I'm joined again with my co-host, Mike. Mike, do you want to give us an update on what we're expecting today?
Yeah, Mike Ruin, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary. Today we're going to be talking about critical infrastructure with Ben Miller from Dragos. Ben, you want to just jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself, company Dragos, and what you guys do?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Hey everyone. I work at Dragos. Dragos is focused on critical infrastructure, ICS specifically, industrial control systems. I've been going at it for about 5 years now. We have a variety of different things that we're known for, I think. Certainly, the Dragos Intelligence produces a lot of quality reports. Some of them are public and have gained, I think, a little bit of reputation at Dragos. We also have our technology where we instill all those indicators and detections back into the platform. I don't do any of those things, though. I work on the services side. So my team delivers professional services, penetration testing, assessments, and our blue team as far as flyaway teams, doing incident response, doing threat hunting, doing incident response plan reviews. All of that centered around industrial control systems and has been a crazy journey. I joined from the electricity sector. I worked at a regulator, NERC, known for NERC ZIP. I actually wasn't on the regulatory side. I was doing some of the voluntary information sharing under the ISAC, but that's certainly my lineage there. And I was an asset owner before that at Constellation Energy, and so it's been very interesting gaining perspective from other verticals beyond electricity and just where everything stands. So it's been a fun journey so far.
Absolutely, that's great. I think one of the things for me is we tend to see a lot more in the news recently about critical infrastructure becoming targeted. What has changed over the, we wasn't so much 10 years ago and probably non-existent 15 years ago where we heard very little about critical infrastructure being targeted by cyber attacks. What has changed in the last 10 years that's really brought it into the forefront? What's causing these companies to become much more victims today?
It's a great question. So I want to say everything and nothing at the same time. I think before we started, you mentioned the S word, Stuxnet.
Yeah, yes.
So Stuxnet was certainly a event that grabbed everyone's attention, and I want to say caused a sequence of events where folks realized they didn't have certain capabilities and they started developing those capabilities. That really started manifesting about 4 or 5 years later when we started seeing a more advanced attacks on critical infrastructure, culminating in Ukraine 2015, Ukraine 2016, and the Trisis/Triton attack that occurred in 2017. And that continued on. I think that still didn't get the perspective of organizations. It was very much Russia's not attacking me sort of construct. But then we started seeing ransomware and unsophisticated attacks across various areas where it really showed just how you don't want to be culpable and be in that position, and that's led to a heightened interest to the degree that we have executive orders that talk about operational technology. Like they actually use the words operational technology. So the degree of focus has really heightened over even just the last 12 months, and it's been interesting being that kind of toad in the water as it slowly increases in temperature.
Then I think that sort of leads to the question I had, which was, is it so much? I mean, like we know that there's been an increase in targeting, but I also feel like some of it's just happenstance. A lot of it isn't really targeted. It's just these criminals are finding different things that are open and vulnerable, maybe not even realizing what it is that they're attacking or what the implications of what they're doing are going to really be. Is that also the case? That's also causing the sort of heightened awareness?
I think it's both for sure. Years ago, well, we were talking about Shodan, and John Matherly's done excellent with Shodan in presenting the problem set to the public. I think everyone's like, oh yeah, that's okay. They didn't accept it as okay, but they didn't necessarily do anything about it, or they didn't have the right tools to do anything about it. Because often when something's on Shodan, it was an accident. It was a misconfiguration. It wasn't like it was their policy to put it online. So it became a hard problem to solve. With those attacks that we're seeing that look very opportunistic of ransomware that moves in from the internet, or just any sort of unauthorized access that moves in from the internet because RDP was exposed, or there was a device itself that was on the internet. That's certainly increasing more and more attention on it. The barrier, I think, has been reduced quite a bit, and that there's a lot more knowledge around these systems than there used to be on the industrial side. But then you also have the nation states that are actively building their capabilities. As I said, they're doing a lot of reconnaissance. They're subtle, and that they're building their toolkit along the way at the same time.
Absolutely. It reminds me, actually, one of the things that I've noticed as well is that absolutely, it started off with governments and nation states doing intelligence gathering, reconnaissance capabilities, developing their offensive capabilities and preparations. And then, of course, we got organized crime who decided, they want a part of it and get into basically, criminal side of things, where you start doing, of course, ransomware. And the accidents started happening when they moved into this affiliate program in the past 24 months, where you've got basically, rather than the criminals themselves, basically they will do it as a service, and then you've got these smaller gangs who are basically just doing opportunistic attacks. And unfortunately, critical infrastructure is becoming secondary victims just because of ransomware. They just want to get money profit out of it. The one thing it reminds me, though, is that one thing I've seen change, and it reminds me of many years ago, I worked in the maritime sector quite aggressively. And it reminds me of a story when, basically, as you mentioned, Shodan, we did a scan one time, and all of a sudden there was an IP range that came up that shouldn't have been, that we should not have seen. Basically, we find basically one of the ship's systems, engine control systems, was now available in the public internet. We're trying to figure out why that was happening. And ultimately, basically, what we end up finding, that investigations and basically checking why the systems were actually in the public domain, was ultimately there was a captain on the ship who decided that didn't want to be basically in the bridge 24/7. And ultimately, they went to their cabin, and they wanted to be able to speak with their family. Back then, they were, of course, using Skype. They could make phone calls back to home. And what they'd done was they basically wanted to be able to see the navigational system in their cabin. So they got a big long cable and basically Ectis connected it to their laptop and created a bridge. And of course, it was during 2000. It was about 2010, 2011. So there was a crew welfare law that said that now crew basically on these long voyages had to have some type of connectivity, so they can actually browse the internet, send emails, connect, talk to their family. And this captain basically unintentionally had created a bridge between basically the bridge of the ship and the public domain using their laptop. And I think this kind of realizes, when we talk about Shodan and we talk about basically OT and IT, there is a convergence of those both coming together, where previously OT was more, let's say, segregated. It was, Stuxnet, of course, brought it, the S word brought it to visibility that, these RGAT systems aren't really as effective. But I think, we've seen a convergence of the two. Do you think that this is causing much more of a problem for organizations as OT and IT are converging and these systems are now becoming more publicly connected than they were previously?
I think in general, they're just becoming more connected, more and more interconnected. And a lot of folks, I don't know if they appreciate what that leads to over time. So you can have a great deployment, whether it's a ship or a SCADA system, a DCS for a plant, a generation plant. After that deployment, more things get added. It's not like they get reduced over time. It only gets more complex and more connections. In one of the one of the things we've been talking more and more at Dragos is just atrophy of the security controls over time. So you can have the best policy. My team, when we're doing assessments, there have been multiple instances where we're doing firewall reviews, and the firewall that has that any permit, and it's commented temporary or test, right? There's nothing more permanent than a test. That continual atrophy of the security program definitely happens, and I think there's a lack of oversight in many ways in these security programs. The traditional enterprise and security apparatus generally does not have visibility into the OT side, and that's likely because IT screwed up before, and OT doesn't trust them anymore. And so when you're talking about safety and uptime, where you're hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars per hour is relying on uptime, you're not going to accept the apology of something that happened 10 years ago. You're going to start limiting their access as much as possible. So it calls that DMARC and a true DMZ, but not against the adversary, against the other teams within the company, and it becomes a really challenging sort of environment. I think the people problem and the organizational problem can be much more amplifying than the technology that we have today in a lot of these environments.
I mean, I think that's human nature in general. Like you look at any industrial, whatever, where there's like safety controls, but then, well, the work needs to get done. And like, we're going to cut corner, like there's always that sort of give and take between the people that want to make sure things are secure or safe or whatever. And the people that are like, well, time is money. And if we follow the exact same, these exact procedures, there'll be downtime, there'll be whatever. And so I guess it's not that surprising that it would show up between those two groups, especially where you're talking about industrial controls, where resiliency is important, uptime is important, all these things, time is money. I have an IT background. We make mistakes. Like sometimes things go down, one bad rule.
I think one of the things is there's a big difference between IT and OT. IT seems to, has a life cycle of 3 to 4 years typically when you're rotating. I've seen maybe maximum 7 years to try to squeeze as much out of it as possible, but you tend to kind of force to update whether new technology, new hardware comes out. In OT, however, I've seen systems, 20, 30 years old that they just don't want to change because it works. And to change it means changing not just one component; it means changing the entire, like production line of something,
and potentially breaking things. I mean, like you look at hospitals, you look at any number of systems; it's the same problem, right? Nobody wants to update because they're scared.
Well, it's even worse than that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
There's support contracts, right? There's support contracts. You buy a turbine that is generating electricity. You don't separately, it's not a la carte where you get to choose which computer is going to run it. Like it is a combined integrated system. And so you can't necessarily just swap out that computer without breaking your warranty, breaking the support contract that you have there. So it is very much I think supply chain's a big topic of late. When you have instrumental vendors and OEMs and partners that are needed for that support, then it becomes a much more complicated perspective. When you have multiple stakeholders that you need to work with on maintaining the latest version of Windows or a controller. And that's a challenge, especially when you're looking at, to your point, a lifespan of 20 years for that equipment. My laptop is 4 years old and it's barely working right now. So it's a challenge.
Because one thing. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to ask, like, is that part of the support contract? Is that becoming a thing now? Are we looking at where these vendors are sort of being asked to say, like, no, we're not just going to support it, but we're also going to patch it and do security updates and stuff like that? Is that becoming part of the norm, or are we still a ways off from that?
Yeah, so there's certainly a base level of we're going to provide you security and patches, but the OEM vendors absolutely have incentivized security services within their portfolio, whether that is expediency, rolling out those patches faster, having environments that are set up at the vendor where they do their testing and staging before they roll out and do that integration testing, to a variety of security services, very similar to what Dragos does. The challenge with often many of those OEMs, you walk into a refinery, it's not just one vendor. Right. It's a lot of vendors. And so that's the challenge of death by 1,000 paper cuts on all of these vendors and how you put your arms around it.
And I'm sure you have a staging refinery, right? Like where you can test all of it. Just a separate refinery that's just standing there waiting for you to do whatever testing you
there's
need.
All kinds of crazy stuff. If you're willing to pay for it, absolutely. There is a very similar analog, or you have your digital twins and a lot of other areas that have been going down from.
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually surprising to hear. I was actually being facetious. I thought for sure you're going to be like, no, nobody's going to build a whole.
But they do. Turn out. So Mike, but they do. So I did years ago in the power station. You're familiar. I've mentioned a few times. What ends up happening is it's not a test environment. It becomes an auxiliary, which means that they use it for basically if they need to do some maintenance on the main site. This becomes an auxiliary to providing, let's say, excess energy. So when the main site's being offline, or they're doing, they'll have multiple engines, and power stations will have two basically, let's say engine centers and command and control. They'll have two of everything. But what happens is it doesn't become just only a test. It becomes an auxiliary. It becomes a backup. It becomes a maintenance site. Rather than basically just somewhere where you test things. So, whenever, for example, even during, high usage times, let's say it comes to Christmas and people put their Christmas tree lights on, they need to have excess energy to go into those. So rather than just being a test site, it becomes an auxiliary type of site for those kind of high usage times, or when they need to do maintenance to the main sites. And this gets
which shouldn't be that surprising because that's the same thing we used to do back in the old days when it was much more expensive to run servers and stuff. We'd have that same stuff. So that's awesome.
So Ben, one of the things that coming into that when you were mentioning earlier, one thing I became familiar with when I was doing even in the maritime side, what I did see, and this was around 2012, 2013, to your point, a lot of the OEM contracts. What ended up happening was that you've got many vendors coming in. You'll have you've the engine, you'll have basically the comms, you'll have satellite vendors, and all getting in, and it comes in this whole integrated system. But what I started seeing was it was convergence into that you buy the hardware, but you don't own the data, meaning that you have to send the data back to the manufacturer. And we've seen this, of course, with autonomous vehicles. You've seen it with home televisions and so forth. You're starting to see that the actual manufacturers are now saying, you own the hardware, but we maintain ownership of the data. Therefore, you need to send the data back to us, meaning that these systems have to have an outbound direction to the internet to get that data back to the manufacturer. And that gets into the support agreements, into diagnostics data, into continuous improvements. Is this also kind of fueling some of the security challenges that a lot of these organizations and critical infrastructure are starting to have?
It's a great point, and so many different angles I could approach it. So if you were to look at a standard model of a network architecture within the industrial environment, it's usually stacked, right, with the enterprise or the internet at top, and then it gets more and more trusted to where you get to the actual IO at the very bottom layer. And that looks very clean and cut, and you're like, okay, that's good. And then you have these maintenance and diagnostics networks that are third party, and that's coming directly out of the side, directly to the control IO level. And then you'll have the comms on something like if it's a larger system, right? So you mentioned ships. If there's a port involved, it has some sort of connectivity to the ships. That's another line that's coming in from radio. So you have all these complex sort of systems. And yet when the enterprise architect looks at it, they often don't see those auxiliary systems. They certainly don't own them. And so the aspect of diagnostic and maintenance networks is absolutely more and more pervasive within the vendors. and it has value too. So it's not so much as like, why are you doing this? Just cut it off. They are saving millions of dollars in maintenance costs by getting ahead of the problem through the telemetry that's coming from these systems. So there is a real value in doing exactly that. But when you look at Kaseya, when you look at some of the other supply chain attacks, SolarWinds, there were 2 OEMs that we know of that were using SolarWinds to track their customers' statuses that were completely black boxed, so that the customers didn't know that these vendors were using them as part of their diagnostic and maintenance network. It was just part of the service delivery, right? So there's all these challenges when you start peeling back the layers of third parties, networks, the software that's used there, the visibility to understand what's going on in these environments. We've seen PowerShell employed by third-party vendors doing scanning activities within customer environments outside of maintenance windows. All sorts of things that you don't want to hear about in one sentence. That happens within these environments, and the asset owners are largely oblivious to them because it didn't have direct impact. It didn't actually do anything harmful. And they don't have logging, they don't have visibility within the network of these environments. So they simply are oblivious to it.
Well, that's optimistic.
The takeaway there is very simple things can have a big impact on their security posture. And it's not even necessarily a high capital cost to implement those sorts of controls.
Should I mean, one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the critical infrastructure side of things is that safety is the top priority. When helicopters landing in a refinery or an oil rig, everything is off. Communications is purely dedicated to the helicopter landing. When you put lives at stake, this is where the priority comes. When I went into the power station, I was worried about, IT security noticing me or, identifying me. But no, it was all about safety. It was all about safety, what not to touch, where to go, make sure that basically, you're basically in the presence of the safety person there all the time. Should security be in the same level as safety? Should it, because it has cascading effects. If security is impacted, a lot of these safety systems are dependent on the security side of things. Should it be at the same level or at least prioritized up there? Because right now, what I find it's not.
Yeah, it should be that same level. I think the challenge in some way is a culture. From a traditional cybersecurity perspective, they feel they're top dog. Like, I'm cybersecurity. I got this, guys. Give me space to work. They will always be trumped by safety. So unless they work and identify how they can feed into the safety program, that's the way you can have a large impact there. Because the local facility, if you're a large refinery or another facility, they absolutely have a safety of culture. You're walking down the stairs and you don't have your hand on the handrail, someone's going to call you out on that, and it's going to be a write-up. It's going to be days of paperwork to do that. Nobody wants that. But that is the safety aspect that they've ingrained in their culture. They have emergency operation centers within the facility to handle weather events or just environmental challenges, explosions, whatever is present in that facility. And then you turn to the cybersecurity team and you're like, I'm going to check the logs. Like, use the EOC, the design that's already been built. You don't need a new incident response plan. You need to tie your incident response plan to those emergency procedures. We've done exercises. One of my analysts was infuriated because they're just going around in circles in the EOC. And he just looks at them. Guys, you're in the EOC. All those binders on the wall, they tell you exactly what you need to do. Just go do it. And then the light bulb triggered, and the cybersecurity guys started talking through the EOC process. Their next exercise they did a year later, entirely different, because they were melding those two different worlds together. and accepting that, hey, there's already something that exists. We don't need to reinvent the NIST 861 to feel good about our incident response plan.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember many of those calls were basically even conference calls. The first 5 minutes was basically a safety notice. For anyone, you shouldn't be walking on the phone. You shouldn't be driving in your car. APR, pull over. All of those safety. Man. It was pure safety. And I remember I used to have them quite often. And every single time you'd had that first 2, maybe it's 5 minutes depending on the company, you'd have a safety notice about all, to your point, handrails, opening doors, walking, telephone. You weren't allowed to walk with your telephone. You had to be sitting basically in a static place before you're allowed to be attending a conference call.
I think it's underappreciated how painful it is to before a meeting that you're hosting to come up with a safety tip that hasn't been done yet. You hear all kinds of things, man. It's like don't sit on or don't stand on a chair that has wheels on it. That's not safe. Like really scraping the bottom of the barrel because you have 9 meetings that day and you have to come up with 5 of them for the meetings that you're holding. But that is the level of culture that electric has, oil, gas, critical manufacturing. It's all very similar, and I think underappreciated the degree of focus that they put in there.
So I think what you're saying is you've just coined SafeSecOps, right? Like safety, security ops. They just need to all come together. It's a whole new term out there.
I love that. Have in there somehow.
But I definitely, this is where we need to be moving. It's all about, we have to relate ourselves to the impact. What is the impact? It is a safety impact? Is it a financial impact? Because I think for too long from security side, we've been focusing purely on our world and everything we do and as a silo approach. And we definitely need to make that convergence. We need to listen to the business or listen to the critical infrastructure teams and understand about how they measure things. And we need to tie everything we do from security into that part of the business, whether it being, getting into whether it being navigation systems or how, let's say emergency rooms in a hospital are impacted if the computer systems are offline. Another point I was kind of thinking as well earlier on my mind, Ben, was that are we seeing, what I've seen in the last probably 5-10 years is much more commercial-based systems being used and the critical infrastructure being sitting on top of it. Where prior to that, probably 15-20 years ago, it was much more proprietary. They were building their own pieces. And then basically it was very, let's say, specialists had to understand about how this all worked. I've started seeing this convergence of both basically commercial-based operating systems and the critical infrastructure components being built on top of it. Is this also because it means that you don't necessarily need to have all the knowledge and be a specialist in critical infrastructure, because a lot of those new commercial systems are available, whether it being a Linux-based system that's been slightly modified. Is that also impacting the ability for, let's say, attackers and nation states or cyber criminals to be more successful because they're using commercial-based systems as well?
I think so. I feel like we've been using commercial-based systems for so long as an underpinnings for many of these technologies that it's a hard question to answer. Like, going back to a lot of the older systems, the RTOS system, real-time operating systems, we're using QNX, which is owned by BlackBerry, and a lot of these underlying those, which back in the early 2000s was a very esoteric sort of language and kind of mystical in that regard. I don't think it is much anymore. The security that we've gained from actually moving to systems, Linux systems, or just custom NIX solutions, or even in some aspects Windows, I have more trust in that than some guy or person at an OEM that built their own operating system. And so that actually gives me a little bit more confidence on the resiliency. There's a lot to be said on software lifecycle and third-party solutions. Somebody, a vendor, could easily buy the network stack that they're using, and they're relying on the security of that network stack. Historically, those have not been a high security, high vetted sort of sets of packages that we've had, especially on the industrial side. The stuff that's tailored towards industrial, it was never considered. Security was never considered as part of the requirements. Yeah. It was always assumed that this device could talk to this device and nobody else has access to it. So why do I care about authentication? I'm reinterpreting serial communications and throwing it into IP encapsulation and off to the races that we go. That's still that's changing slowly, but that's still a very much present sort of artifact that we have in the industry on the software itself. You had earlier mentioned consequences as well,
yes.
And that there's a difference of conversation when you talk to the engineer at the facility and a cybersecurity professional. The engineer at the facility is going to describe how it was designed and how it operates. The cybersecurity professional is going to talk about how they can manipulate that to do something unexpected. And the response back to the engineer is, well, we didn't design for that. It's like, that's correct. And that there's a lot of discussion happening. There's some, I think it's underappreciated how smart these engineers are. Like if you give them a challenge, like, hey, I'm going to try and manipulate this, they can actually change the logic in their controllers to at least flag that sort of setting or high set point or whatever it is. To bubble up to the system operators and the engineers. We're at the very beginning of that journey, I feel like. It's been over 10 years at this point. And yet we're still at the very beginning of being able to influence a lot of those discussions.
So what is some of the impacts that you've seen? Because ones that I've kind of looked at, I've been DEF CON many years and Black Hat and listening to a lot of the talks related to ICS. I've also seen a lot of the research papers, and one that comes to mind is around I think it was a wind turbine where it had I think when we talk about the kinetic impacts that a lot of times a critical infrastructure will have, where it can have some moving parts or it can cause some damage. And I think it was, remember one where it was the wind turbine had it was a emergency, it was a safety feature for a hard stop. But if you did it multiple times, you hard stop, turn it on again, hard stop, you could actually get to a point where you actually completely damage the turbine itself, unrepairable. Where you'd actually have to completely rebuild or remove it. So what have you seen when cyber attacks happen with critical infrastructure? What is some of the impacts that you've seen and can share with us?
So I remember that talk. I think that was a Georgia Tech talk that individual was representing when they gave that. And prior to that, I talked to a wind farm operator and was questioning them. And this goes back to sometimes the engineers are more clever than you realize. There were actually on this particular wind farm and this particular turbine, like I have to be very specific, they had manual overrides in there where it couldn't have tripped repeatedly. There were manual systems that just you need to go there physically and move something to reset it. So there's always that aspect of just because the computer says you're doing it doesn't mean you're actually doing it component, which is the great aspect of leveraging your facilities, your engineering teams to great regard. Which means it's a lot more challenging to have an impact. I think the large impacts that we've had have been fairly public, whether it's the refinery trip, which impacted safety systems, by the way. The refinery trip, because the safety system itself that is there to safeguard catching an unsafe event and shutting the process down, that was directly manipulated and impacted with the Trisis attack. The Ukraine 2016, 2015 attacks impacted upwards of 220,000 customers for a series of hours. Basically, the windshield time from a person driving out in their bucket truck to the substation to manually put the breakers online. Some of the other a lot of the other cases that I'm aware of are like near misses or assumption that what was it cyber. The fire systems in a data center triggering twice in 2 days. And like, what was that? Was that cyber? And doing the walkthrough and realizing there was a phone line that was connected in there and doing the analysis of what was it cyber? It didn't end up being cyber. Those are more often the cases than not. The ransomware is definitely a big one. We've again near misses where it took down the facility, but the one facility that I'm thinking of was already in maintenance cycle, so they weren't actually directly impacted by that, other than they needed to restore within 3 days to get out of maintenance cycle and not have the pressures of that. So there's a lot of those near misses that occur pretty regularly. Ransomware is a big pain. It often doesn't have a direct operational impact in many cases. Like if you're an operator managing a SCADA environment, you don't necessarily need real-time visibility. Like you're getting visibility in the order of like generally minutes across a large region, a city, whether it's water, power, etc. It's not like the system operator is. It's not a video game where they're controlling the entire thing along the way. They're in the loop, but they're there to catch things that go awry, not continually maintain it. And that's where high redundancy environments in these environments tend to be assumed to be very simple, but they have redundant networks, and then they have a backup control center along with that also has redundant networks and multiple failover mechanisms. So it starts to add a lot of complexity, and certainly ransomware can have an impact across all of those sites. But it's dependent on the security architecture and how you're doing credentials in many ways is what leads to those sorts of impacts.
Yeah. So one thing I was interested in as well was that I do a lot of digital forensics and incident response. And in the past, what I tend to do is when I'm doing an incident investigation, you're on the network and you tend to find that you might be investigating one incident, and all of a sudden you find that maybe 6 months ago there was another attacker on the network that maybe didn't do anything, but maybe it was they sold the access to the next attacker. I was interested with the watering hole research that you just wrote the paper on and released the blog on. I was interested in that. How many times do you tend to, when you're doing, let's say response or doing penetration testing, do you find that there's, multiple attackers on the network? Some have motive and some don't. How often does that occur? Because that was a really interesting paper when I read it.
That's actually, so it doesn't happen too often. That said, it's happened a couple of times so far this year, but it's the minority for sure. In the context around that for your audience as well is Oldsmar was a water treatment facility in lower part of Florida. In the February timeframe, the city disclosed that they had a event where somebody gained remote access and put a chemical, tried to put a chemical into the water supply by using the HMI, the human machine interface, which is really just a diagram of the process, and they're able to click a button, click another button. But it was a very carcinogenic chemical. The operator saw it as it happened and just said, "No, don't do that." And so they were literally doing their job as one of the components of the overall system. Kind of brittle if that's what you're relying on from a security perspective, but it did prevent any sort of real damage in that regard. At the same time, so when that public release happened, and the sheriff and the mayor explained the walkthrough and the dynamics of that, the time it happened, our intel team started looking at the data from various sources that we have, and we started piecing together that morning, a web host went to a website that led to a series of essentially exploit kit type behavior, fingerprinting of the workstation, and continual redirects and interesting sort of dynamics, and then it stopped. And it was like, well, was there exploit that was actually delivered that actually led to this event? Was it much more complicated than we thought it was, or what's going on there? So the Intel team focused on it for a good month of just pulling it apart, and what we came to is that it was fingerprinting workstations for use in other campaigns, and it didn't have any sort of direct relationship to the attack itself. But it had all the hallmark signs of something more sophisticated. The Waterhole website itself, the victim website, was a construction company that focused on water facilities in Florida, and that's so the asset owner Oldsmar who went there, I'm sure they were one of their suppliers or potential suppliers, and that's what led to the series of events that cascaded down. Seems like a odd thing, but if we had more visibility into that entire campaign of all of the victim water holding websites, there's probably a diverse group there, and that the continual theme would be that they had some sort of WordPress plugin or some sort of exploit that was consistent among them, and that's what led to what seemingly looked like a targeted waterhole attack was simply a waterhole attack to grab fingerprints for a workstation browser. So
basically reconnaissance gathering, basically for maybe a later campaign or something. They were basically just
it's definitely a possibility, and that's where the trail ran cold, and we were excited for a while of potentially seeing something that was much more nefarious than say somebody finding this an Oldsmar host or TeamViewer client on Shodan or just brute forcing those credentials. But at the end of the day, all signs are pointing towards something like that.
Right. So from your perspective, are we in a good place, or have we a lot of work to do ahead of us? I mean, it sounds like with a lot of
those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive. We might be in a good place with a lot of work to do, I think.
Yes. So, I mean, for me, from what we are seeing, it's going to get worse, I think, before we really get kind of a priority. I think the executive order that was recently done is a realization that, it's from the top, of the government, that they do have basically this is a priority. They do have visibility, and they're now putting together, whether it being task force, whether it being specialists, they're now, gathering experts at the top of the level to observe and to watch and decide what course of action. I think that's a good starting point. My fear is that there's a lot of criminal gangs out there that's basically getting safe havens from certain nation states that will continue to operate until those governments or until some type of collaboration is going to hold them accountable. My fear is it's going to get worse over the next year or two before reaction or before the prioritization of this is kind of really kind of brought into, let's say, investing security as a safety measure. Any thoughts, or what's your view on that?
So I certainly think that the policies, U.S. government, other government levels, coming to agreement on what is unacceptable. It has been something that hasn't happened yet. Could have happened a long time ago, and can help deter some of this. It certainly won't stop it. Where Dragos is tracking 15 activity groups that focus on critical infrastructure. That number's not going to go down. Like, it's not going down to zero. That cat is out of the bag. We're never going to recover that. And so now it's how much damage can be done while we work on more controls. And where Dragos is focused on is visibility. Understand what's going on in your environments, understand who's authenticating in, how they're gaining access, what commands are being issued to your controllers, how your if your HMI happens to be trying to beacon out to the internet, you should be aware of that. And so it's instrumenting not just along the perimeter of these systems, but deep in them to be able to support your incident response plan. Many of the cases that our customers do have an incident response plan, they have no data to back it up. When you go to do incident response, and you're like, okay, I'm here. Like, well, we have these hosts. Like, do you have logs? Let me look. No, it's only for 24 hours and then it rolls over. And like all these challenges. What do you expect a forensics person to really do other than to explain, well, I know what happened over the last 24 hours, or maybe be able to extend it back 30 days with dead host forensics on a hard drive and whatnot. And so that's a real challenge when you're asked to do forensics in an environment that is not forensics rich. It's not log rich. And this has always been a problem. And it's where Dragos has been making inroads in there with our technology.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. Is that, in traditional IT environments, it's not, forensics and evidence rich to start with. And a lot of the attackers will delete the logs and delete every evidence before you even get the chance to review it. And even more so in OT side of things is that when you've got 24 hours of logs to deal with for an attack that's been going on for maybe weeks or months, it's very difficult. You have a piece of the puzzle, but not the big picture, and sometimes it's very hard to get root cause analysis or do some type of attribution. So Mike, any final thoughts or any things that you have that you would?
No, I mean, I think this has been a great conversation. I appreciate Ben joining us. I think, we talk a lot about these convergences in all these different spaces, whether it's, across technology. And I think it's just sort of funny how that theme plays out. Like, well, our security people need to work with our safety people. Whether, in software engineering, it's our security people need to work more closely, be teamed up with the software developers. And, it's just this I think it's just more continuation of that same theme of how do we work together and create more of a team approach to this, as opposed to more what's been historically an adversarial approach of, we give you the report and you program against it, or you go fix it. So just sort of more collaboration across the teams and more security by design. And we'll just keep beating that drum.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I will absolutely say with a lot of the activity that's occurred over just the last, where are we in July, the last 8 months or so, there's been a reliance historically on, we're air gapped. And you dive into that, that's bullshit. I'm sorry, my language. That's wrong. The board doesn't know that's wrong. They've accepted that as an answer for a number of years. They thought the risk was mitigated because they were told they were air gapped. And then when you dig into it, it's like, well, by air gap, I mean, it's on a separate VLAN. It's like, that's not an air gap, right?
I mean, even humans, in a real air gap, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even in a real air gap, we know that it doesn't exist, right? There's there's the sneaker network.
Once humans interact with it, there's no air gap. That's that was the key. I mean, we go back to looking at Stuxnet. Once you have people going in and out, interacting, you might be physically disconnected, but you might have sensors that can influence. We've seen basically Li-Fi where you can actually communicate with light, with sound, with people. That's the kind of when you assume that air gap exists. When you have the air gap, means that basically it's buried in the ground and no one can get to it. When you disconnect it, but air gap tends to means that it becomes almost limited in very little value when it has that data has not been used. So
the closest system we have is the International Space Station, and that's not air gapped either.
exactly. And one thing is, there's been a lot of talk about one final question around zero trust, and for we're doing a lot of zero trust in IT. The challenge I've got, I'm not a big fan of the term. I prefer continuous verification. It's all about making sure you verify, authenticate, verify, audit is my kind of preference. But when you get into OT side of things, is zero trust even possible, or do you put zero trust around let's say the air gap. What's your thoughts around that side?
I think we have a long way to go. I think the approach historically within these environments is the opposite of that, of all trust.
It's all trust everything.
Yes, there's zero authentication. There's very little integrity, and certainly no encryption. So you have the name of the game, which is if you gain access to the environment, if you know what you want to do, you can do it. And with the lack of visibility and controls, you'll get away with it too, and nobody will know that what actually caused the event. With exception of like extreme cases of piecing together a crazy series of events in order to tell that story. So it's certainly that's not to say it's not possible, but the technology, especially as you move to the equipment that's sensing and actuating the environment, it's completely oblivious to those concepts right now. And when we have that life cycle of 20 years where this equipment is deployed, you can start to understand how much it takes to turn this ship around and what we can do with it.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Really enlightening, really kind of interesting conversation. It brings back a lot of memories for me. Any final comments or words for the audience, around what things maybe they can do today, what practices they can do just to get themselves on the right track?
I would go back to the idea that the folks that understand this facility and care about it more than the cybersecurity professional, quite frankly, are the ones that built it and maintain it. Buy them donuts and walk over and move out of your cubicle, your safety zone, and really understand how these systems work. You're a hacker, you're inquisitive. In order to do that, you need to start a conversation, and it's not in reading a man page. It's talking to these engineers, understanding what they're doing often is mapping physics to computers and manipulating the world in a very unique way. It's really cool stuff. But in order to understand it, you have to talk to them and you have to have the conversation of, well, what if I do this? What if somebody misuses your system? And gain those relationships. That's going to have a large impact on just the organization and how the organization thinks through it by continually having those discussions. Every Friday, go out to the field and meet the guys, buy some donuts. You'll get them every time with the donuts.
Very wise words, and I definitely think that's something we all can do, even outside of critical infrastructure in all businesses, is understand the user, listen, understand what motivates them and what they get measured on for success. Because if you understand their measurements and understand their metrics and how they see success, that allows us to map security into how we can help them, not basically how we do security for the sake of a checkbox for the sake of security. That it all about it basically enables and empowers the organization to meet those metrics and success. So wise words. And Ben, it's been fantastic having you on the show. Keep up the great work at Dragos. Fantastic. Things that haven't been in the foreground and in the visibility for many years. I think it's great to make sure that we prioritize. We make sure that critical infrastructure is protected, because a lot of that is what it keeps the lights on. It keeps basically us in society doing the things we can, because a lot of those things that happen in the background, whether it being when you hit that light switch and the light comes on, or whether you get in your car and you drive to the shop, and whether the food you get in the store, all of those things are basically powered by critical infrastructure, whether it being logistics, travel, communications, money, and even life-saving things like hospitals and medicine. So keep up the great work. It's been a pleasure. For the audience, make sure you tune in every 2 weeks for 401 Access Denied. And we're here to make sure you keep up with the latest news, latest trends, and just keep you informed and educated. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. All the best, and take care.